friends proving it's never personal, only politics.
Please allow me to introduce myself.
And now, here are your hosts, Dom and Crute.
Welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Devil's Advocate Show. This day has been a year plus in the making, Dominic.
Yes, it has.
This is the day when you burst your gubernatorial cherry, if you will, and ask the question of Scott Walker that you've been dying to ask for so very long, Dominic. And I was proud of you.
Thanks,
you
man.
waited your turn.
I was polite.
You were quite polite. And then I thought you almost were too polite. I heard the guy say, one more question. And I'm thinking, man, is Dominic going to get up there? Is he going to burst out?
I tried. All these guys were asking
And
questions.
some guy jumps up with a wolf hunt question. And I'm thinking, man, that was the last question of the day on the wolf hunt. And then the waters parted for just a moment. It's like the sun burst down upon you. And you had the opportunity to ask the question you've been dying to ask. I would have asked him a different question, in fact. I thought here's maybe where you were going to go.
Tell me something, my friend. You ever dance with the devil in the pale moonlight? What?
And that was going to be Scott Walker's reaction. What? What are you talking about? Holy schmoly, Batman. But instead, you composed yourself and you methodically asked the question that you've been dying to ask oh so very long since you bothered to do the homework and realized Scott Walker has been fudging the budget numbers. It's hard to say back to back.
Sir, you have repeatedly said that your policies have taken us from a $3.6 billion budget deficit to a $400+ million surplus. In reviewing the state controller's annual fiscal reports and the comprehensive annual fiscal reports, cash accounting, accrual accounting, there's no number of $3.6 billion. Could you clarify your statement for me, please?
What? That was kind of his reaction initially, was it not, Dominic? What did you think the governor answered your very direct, if not long and methodical question?
I think he insinuated the first. I did ask a follow-up question. The answer to that question, yeah, he answered that okay. I asked a follow-up question, and I would say, Crudy, he did not.
Shocking.
He did not. And this is the thing, and I'm comparing, we talked about these budget numbers before, and again, he's gone out and said this out in national news. He said it today in front of the Wisconsin Realtors Association. That's where we were. That's where the governor was speaking, and he makes this continued claim. And it just doesn't make any sense to me, Mike. I mean, if we were going to go and apply for a loan, okay, we would bring our tax returns to the underwriting, right? To the bank. Here's my tax returns. Here's my life. Here's the tax returns. I wouldn't bring my Excel budget spreadsheet of what I thought might be. You actually bring historical factual data. And when you go out and you give the spreadsheet number to the American people, which isn't actually what the numbers were, to the underwriters, and nobody has time to ask follow-up questions. Everybody's got to be nice to the governor, Mike. This is what I struggle with. That's not me.
Being nice?
Yes.
That's your largest challenge.
If you were giving me the same line that the governor was giving me, I would be all up in your ass about that, Mike. But I can't do that to the governor because I want to be invited back to the party. So I asked him about as nicely as I could. Let's just play the whole clip so everyone gets the feel for how it went.
Sir, you have repeatedly said that your policies have taken us from a $3.6 billion budget deficit to a $400+ million surplus. In reviewing the state controller's annual fiscal reports and the comprehensive annual fiscal reports, cash accounting, accrual accounting, there's no number of $3.6 billion. Could you clarify your statement for me, please?
Sure. It's a number that came out 2 years ago at the time when the Fiscal Bureau put out the projections. The numbers we're talking about, the start of the budget process, as it is with all the different things. But that's where we started. When we started right after we were elected, that was the number of projections that were given. That's where we went from that point.
If you're going to compare the success of your policies, wouldn't it be more appropriate to compare your $400 million surplus projected this year to the actual annual fiscal report of $312 or $342 million that we had last year? Wouldn't it be more of an apples comparison?
Well, if you want to do a cash on hand, again, if you even look at the bond range, part of the reason why we've been stable is we went this last time from having a substantial cash balance to having a very small fraction in the previous 2 cycles before I was governor. So there's all different ways to compare it. But under any comparison, we've done successfully well.
Well, yeah, there's all different ways to compare it, Crude, if you want to compare
If
it.
you used a metric that allowed people to have some reasonable point of comparison, well, that would be calling it cash accounting, Dominic.
That would, and he actually does have a point. If we look at the annual report, in 2012, using cash accounting, we had a surplus of $342 million, and this year we'll be up from that $400 to $500 million. That would be
Is that additional or is that cumulative?
That's left cash in the
surplus?
bank. It's the cash in the bank at the end of the year. But it's more than last year, right? So that is a positive, I guess, unless you look behind the numbers, unless you borrowed $1 billion that you don't have to worry about it and you got $1 billion in the bank. But again, at least it is an apples to apples comparison, Mike, not the Legislative Fiscal Bureau budget spreadsheet instead of actual tax returns.
Well, I'm proud of you, Cinderella. You made it all the way to the ball. You got up to the prince and you asked your tough question, and you got the same sort of runaround answer that Scott Walker tends to give everyone. So, you've been initiated now into the journalist, the fourth estate, if you will,
But
Dominic.
this is a struggle for me, Mike. I'm not a journalist.
Well, clearly.
And if I'm going to, I'm okay with being a little rough around the edges because that's real life. If you were to say the same thing to me, Mike, I wouldn't let you get away with it. I would be all over you. Mr. Governor, how can you possibly compare the Legislative Fiscal Bureau's initial number to what was actually there and then use cash versus accrual, asks versus this? You know what? In Wallace, when he was on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace, you don't challenge the metric, right? That's what you teach. You don't challenge the metric. If your guest says 3.6 to 400 billion, well, what do? You got to go on. You go on to your next question. You got a whole show planned. No one has time to get in the weeds on any of this stuff. And so ultimately, we let these politicians continually slide. Happens to be Walker this time.
But you thanked him. You did a little selective editing. I didn't hear that on the end of your soundbite, but I heard it the first time. You're like,
no, it's on there.
Thank you, Governor Walker,
I started
for answering
talking.
my question.
Hey, I'm always a please and thank you guy. Unless we get to the point where we don't have to be crude, I would love to have that conversation. But again, if we want to go back to the dance, we can't be throwing eggs in a guy's face.
Well, okay. I commend you, my friend, because you are, the everyman. Dominic, you are Mr. Milwaukee showing up and doing a radio show. I mean, maybe you've got a little better education than the average Joe, but, I'm not going to give that to your credit. You are just, an average guy talking politics with a good friend like me on the radio. I enjoy this field trip that we took today, Dominic, but, there were more important questions than the one he failed to answer that you asked.
Yes, sir.
There were questions asked about the bonding issue in the state budget proposal by Scott Walker. He is going to bond about $1 billion, and almost entirely the first $1 billion that he will need to borrow to fulfill the current asks or his budget priorities is almost $950 million for the zoo interchange in the Home Bridge. Now, Dominic, it seems like that is investment in infrastructure, if you will, in the state of Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not here to club the governor for proposing improvements in those regard. But here's where I will start to club him. How many times have I heard the governor complain and say that I cannot expand Medicaid because the federal government cannot be trusted to fully fund the program? And we're not going to go there because somewhere in the future, the government could run out of that Medicaid money and it could leave us with a higher, portion of it falling to the state of Wisconsin, which is his rationale for, charging small employers another 24 to 36 million through failure to expand Medicaid. And it is his rationale is to not be part of the federal institution. But why is it that he has no issue taking federal highway funds, Dominic? If the federal government is teetering on the brink of insolvency, he called these projects once-in-a-lifetime generational projects, huge outlays, $1 billion project between two infrastructure projects. If he's got no confidence in the federal government's ability to continue to invest money back in the states, why does he take the federal highway fund so readily, my friend?
Well, great point, Crudy.
Boom!
I would say this. Because if the federal government walks away tomorrow, they're not going to leave us with, several 100,000. I don't know what the actual number of people would be that are, on the Medicaid system without them coming through and supporting what they said they were going to do and fund the system and fund Medicaid to the states, Mike. And
I'm sorry, Scott Walker, say that again because you didn't answer my question.
What is the downside of taking, if the federal government next year, all right, has no federal transportation funds, what are we left with holding the bag? If you compare that
incomplete projects like the zoo interchange that, as he joked at the news conference, has been going on since he was a little boy. And then the home bridge. I mean,
last time it was done was when he was a little boy, Crudy. But these projects will take a couple of years. I mean, unless the federal government's going to run out of federal money in a couple of years, Mike, there's really no risk to it. Versus going the other way when the federal government is already going to, knowingly as part of the program, pull back on their contributions to 90%. I mean, and that's a longer-term issue. Obamacare, as we've discussed many times, and I would say to you, Mike, has some funding problems that may not last. The federal government, there's no such tie, there's no weight around the state of Wisconsin as it pertains to the transportation funds because that project will be done in a couple of years.
You know what? Scott Walker was probably happy when that guy went back to asking him questions about the wolf hunt. And I'll be happy when Scott Walker bases the music that Medicaid's the rational way to go. Let's expand Medicaid